This move immediately seizes central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for rapid development and potential attacking opportunities. By mirroring white's central pawn push, black immediately contests the d4 and d5 squares, opening lines for development and preparing to challenge white's central control in this fundamental opening gambit. This developing move directly attacks black's central pawn, initiating classical king's pawn opening theory and preparing to castle. This move develops a piece towards the center and indirectly defends the e5 pawn, establishing a solid foundation for the defense and preparing for counterplay. This move initiates the Italian game, a classical opening aiming to quickly develop the bishop to an active square that controls the center and pressures the f7 pawn. This move transposes into the Italian game, a foundational opening where black mirrors white's active bishop development, aiming for central control and prepared kingside castling. This move prepares to build a strong pawn center with d4, aiming to control more central squares and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This move, nf6, directly challenges white's central pawn and initiates an aggressive development, a common response within the four knights game, aiming to contest central space and prepare for kingside castling. This move, d4, aggressively challenges black's central pawn and knight, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and gain central space, a key principle in many opening systems like the Italian game. This capture opens the center, challenging white's central pawn thrust and leading to an increased dynamic engagement of pieces in the ensuing middle game. This move embraces the Italian game's main line, immediately challenging black's central pawn and opening the c-file for potential future piece activity. This check forces white to address the immediate threat and will likely lead to a simplification of the position, potentially entering a common variation of the Italian game where black aims for active piece play. This move, bd2, strategically offers an exchange of bishops to simplify the position and improve white's pawn structure, while also preventing black from gaining further initiative with the check. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, black simplifies the position, removes white's actively placed bishop, and forces white to recapture with the queen, which can lead to a queen trade and a simpler endgame. This move recaptures a piece, developing the knight and maintaining central pawn control while opening lines for potential future piece activity. This move challenges white's central pawn majority and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to equalize the pawn structure and activate pieces. This pawn capture opens the d-file, creating central tension and forcing black to address the immediate pawn threat while potentially sacrificing their central majority. This move recaptures the central pawn, opening lines for your pieces and initiating a thematic pawn exchange in this popular Italian game variation. This move, qb3, is a common and effective response in the Italian game, specifically the Scotch Gambit declined, aimed at immediately challenging black's central pawn majority and potentially creating attacking opportunities against the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to defend the e5 pawn and potentially contest the open d-file, while also eyeing opportunities on the kingside. Castling kingside is a crucial defensive maneuver, moving the king to safety behind a pawn shield and activating the rook for future central control. The move 11-00 is a crucial defensive maneuver to safeguard the king and prepare for the middle game struggle, allowing the king to escape the center and potentially connect the rooks. This move repositions the rook to an open file, increasing its attacking potential and preparing to potentially double rooks for increased pressure. On white's queenside. This move strengthens black's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the d4 square, aiming to undermine white's central space and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside. This knight maneuver prepares to challenge black's central control and potential queenside expansion by aiming for the f6 square, reinforcing the d4 pawn. This move, 13, h6, is a prophylactic maneuver designed to prevent white's knight from potentially infiltrating to g5 with disruptive threats, while also creating a luft for the black king. This knight maneuver initiates a potent centralizing strategy, aiming to exploit the weakness on d5 and potentially create attacking opportunities against black's kingside by shifting pressure. This move aims to contest the central dark squares and potentially target white's queenside pawns. By exploiting the slight lack of coordination after white's knight maneuver, this move aggressively challenges black's queen and knight on the queenside, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially create weaknesses in the pawn structure. Trading queens here simplifies the position, allowing black to focus on activating their pieces and potentially creating queenside counterplay. This move simplifies the position by exchanging bishops, which is generally favorable for white as it removes black's strong bishop on c5 and opens the a 2-8 diagonal for white's queen. The rook now supports the b-pawn, securing it against further attacks and preparing to potentially contest the b-file or offer a pawn sacrifice to open lines later. This move activates the rook, preparing to control the central e-file and potentially support a knight advance or provide defense for the kingside if needed. The knight re-establishes central influence, challenging white's pieces and preparing to contest the d5 square. This move resolves the tension on the f5 square, eliminating black's active knight and simplifying the position, which generally favors white in the endgame due to the rook on the e-file. This move recaptures the knight, aiming to trade pieces and simplify the position, which can be beneficial when a player has a slight material or positional disadvantage. This capture on d5 resolves white's central tension, eliminating black's central pawn and opening the d-file for potential piece activity while simplifying into a slightly more favorable endgame for white. This pawn capture on d5 creates a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, but importantly opens the c-file for their rook and frees the d7 pawn, allowing for more dynamic piece play. This pawn push seeks to disrupt black's rook on b8 and gain space on the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses for black to exploit later. The move 20, bh7 strategically repositions the bishop to a safer square and prepares to contest the d5 pawn, aiming to alleviate white's strong central control and pressure. White repositions the rook to the only open file, reinforcing the central control and preparing to contest key squares while solidifying the pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to the open d-file, aiming to challenge white's control and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges on that central file. This move initiates a kingside pawn storm to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's rook and attack the black king. This move weakens the light squares around your king, creating potential targets for white's remaining pieces, especially after the exchange of queens. This knight move repositions white's knight to a central square, preparing to potentially challenge black's control of the d-file and support future pawn advances. On the kingside, this pawn push on g5 weakens the kingside pawn structure and creates potential targets for white's pieces, particularly on the light squares. This move establishes a strong outpost for the rook on the 7th rank, restricting black's kingside mobility and preparing to exploit the weakened pawn structure after f6. Black's move challenges white's advanced rook on e7, aiming to eliminate a strong attacking piece and prepare to activate their own rook on the d-file. This pawn capture opens the h-file, creating attacking opportunities against black's king and potentially creating a passed pawn on g5. After further exchanges, capturing on g5 opens the h-file for white's rook and concedes central pawn control, potentially weakening black's king position. This rook check exploits white's active piece placement, forcing black's king into a more exposed position and potentially setting up further attacks along the open files. This recapture is forced to avoid losing material to the rook's check and opens the e-file for white's rook, creating pressure on black's position. This rook exchange simplifies the position and leads to a pawn endgame where white's king is more active, a key advantage in such endgames. This king move is a necessary repositioning to escape the checks on the open file and prepare for the rook endgame where king activity becomes crucial for defense and potential counterplay. This knight redeploys to the central e1 square, preparing to contest the important central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn push or a switch to the queenside, indicating a strategic regrouping. This move aims to centralize the rook and contest the open c-file, potentially challenging white's control and preparing for future defense or counterplay. This move aims to shore up the kingside pawn structure, preparing to defend the vulnerable f2 square and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance. The rook on e8 is now trapped on the back rank after the exchange, and this king move aims to create an escape square for the king on f7, preparing to activate it in the endgame. The move 30, rb8 aims to exploit the weakness on the b-file and potentially force a favorable exchange of rooks, to simplify into an endgame where white's material advantage might be more pronounced. This move activates the king, seeking to contest the open files and support the rook's defense of the b-pawn. This move activates the king, preparing to participate in the endgame and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or contest. Open files. This move strengthens the queenside pawn structure, preparing to potentially advance the b-pawn to challenge white's rook on b8. The rook on a8 aggressively occupies the 7th rank, aiming to infiltrate black's position and restrict the king's mobility, potentially setting up a mating net or winning material. Black's bishop, now on b1, has found a very active diagonal, putting pressure on the white king and potentially supporting a future pawn advance on the queenside. This move initiates a queenside pawn advance to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn, while also preparing to support the rook on the a-file. This move attempts to provoke white into allowing the black bishop to reach a more active diagonal on the kingside after white's likely recapture. The king consolidates its position, preparing to support the rook on a8 and potentially assist in defending the queenside pawns. This move attempts to reroute the rook to the g7 square via h7 to potentially disrupt white's king safety or support a pawn push, though it also allows white to reinforce their pawn chain and prepare for further central play. This check forces black's king to a more exposed square, consolidating white's control over the open e-file and preparing to exploit black's vulnerable king position. This move forces white's rook to retreat from the open file, as the king can no longer safely capture the rook. The rook's relocation to f8 activates a dangerous battery along the 8th rank, threatening the black king and preparing to exploit weaknesses in black's position. This check is a tactical forcing move that aims to exploit black's vulnerable king position. potentially leading to exchanges and simplifying the game to black's disadvantage given white's superior piece activity. The king activates by moving to a more central and less exposed square, preparing to support the rook's activity and potentially participate in the endgame. The king's current central positioning is risky. It should aim to find safety behind its pawns or participate in the defense of a flank. This rook maneuver aims to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and pressure black's relatively exposed king, potentially leading to mating threats or material gain if black mismanages the defense. This move aims to consolidate the rook on the 7th rank, supporting the pawn advance and preventing black from activating their king in the center. This rook check forces the black king to a less active square, potentially allowing white to regroup their pieces more effectively in the endgame. The king's retreat to f7 aims to consolidate the position, offering the king safety and preparing to defend the b6 pawn after the recent rook checks. This move activates the rook, aiming to exploit the weak back rank and potentially create threats against black's king or advance. The a-pawn. Black's move of placing the bishop on b3 attacks the rook on a8, forcing white to defend it and potentially giving black a tempo to consolidate or initiate further counterplay on the queenside. nd3 aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or controlling key central squares as the game transitions towards an endgame. The move 41. Ba4 aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the a-file or to support a pawn push on the queenside. The rook's advance along the h-file pressures the black king and seeks to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes or a decisive attack. The king is exposed on the light squares, and black needs to coordinate his pieces to defend against white's attack, particularly the rook on the h-file and the knight aiming for g4. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses and open lines for attack against the black king, while simultaneously trying to disrupt black's rook activity. The king is exposed in the center, and this check forces it to retreat, allowing black to regroup and consider its next defensive or counter-attacking options. The rook sacrifice on e8 opened up the king and created tactical chances, but white failed to exploit them, and now black's rook is actively placed on c2, posing an immediate threat to the king and potentially leading to a forced checkmate sequence or significant material loss for white. This move aims to complicate the position by creating counterplay on the kingside, potentially tying down white's pieces and opening lines for black's rook. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create an open file for white's remaining rook, forcing further defensive concessions. This move by black aims to consolidate the king's position by placing it on a more secure square, away from the immediate threat of white's f-pawn advance and the active rook. The rook on h8 activates to the h-file, supporting a potential pawn push or creating mating threats against black's exposed king. This checks the white king, forcing it to a less safe square and aiming to disrupt white's coordination or potentially win material if the king is forced to block. This move, Kade2, attempts to bring the white king closer to the action, potentially to support the rook on h8 or to participate in the kingside defense as the position becomes more open. The black king, having been driven from its cozy castled position, is now actively seeking refuge, with this move aiming to tuck it behind the pawn chain on the kingside. A necessary defensive maneuver in this highly tactical and compromised position. The knight repositions to b4, aiming to support the pawn advance on the queenside or potentially jump to c6 to attack black's rook, creating greater defensive pressure. The rook on g4 is now actively participating in the game, threatening the knight on d3 and potentially creating complications on the g-file. This move exploits the discovered attack on black's king as white's knight moves from b4, forcing black to give up material or face further immediate threats. This move attempts to centralize the king and avoid further checks from the rook, but it allows white's knight to capture the pawn on d5. A material gain that simplifies the position in white's favor. This move, nxf6, sacrifices the knight to eliminate black's last central pawn and open lines for white's king to potentially participate in the endgame, though black's king is currently quite active. This recapture is necessary to prevent white from activating their rook on the d-file and consolidating their material advantage. This move, kc3, attempts to centralize the king to support the rook and potentially create a passed pawn, while also considering the immediate threat of the black rook on d4. This rook move seeks to activate the piece by swinging it over to the kingside, aiming to create threats against white's king by potentially supporting a pawn push or directly attacking down the open files that may arise. This knight check forces black's king to move, allowing white to potentially consolidate their material advantage by regaining the pawn on d5. The move, k5, attempts to consolidate the king's position by bringing it closer to the center and potentially supporting pawn advances, but it exposes the king to further checks from white's knight. The move exchanges the rook for black's knight, simplifying the position and aiming to promote the passed pawn on the queenside after the king has moved. This pawn capture maintains the material balance and creates a passed pawn on the h-file, which may prove difficult to stop given white's compromised kingside. The move ing5 aims to activate the knight to a more central outpost, potentially eyeing squares like f7 or h7, while also forcing black to consider the safety of their king and pawn structure. The bishop retreats to a passive diagonal, allowing white to solidify their queenside pawn structure and prepare a dangerous pawn push with the king. This pawn advance is designed to create a passed pawn on the f-file, which will become a significant attacking threat against black's exposed king in the endgame. The king must stay active in the endgame, and here it seeks a safer square, avoiding the immediate threats and preparing to support the rook's defense of the passed pawn. This pawn push aims to activate the king by creating a pathway to the queenside, preparing to support the passed pawn and challenge black's rook. This move continues white's plan to create a passed pawn with the f-pawn, but black can now try to stop it by directly attacking white's king, which is somewhat exposed on the open diagonal. This move promotes the passed pawn, creating an unstoppable force that will likely lead to a decisive material advantage or checkmate. With white's king poised for activation, black's move 57, k7, is a defensive retreat, aiming to protect the pawn on g5 and prepare for the king's potential involvement in the endgame. This move, by capturing the pawn, initiates the endgame transition with a significant material advantage, aiming to promote the remaining passed pawn decisively. The recapture of the knight with the bishop is a positional concession, opening a path for white's king to infiltrate and potentially create a passed pawn on the h-file. The move k5 aims to centralize the king, activating it in the endgame and preparing to support the f-pawn's advance towards promotion, while also potentially creating mating threats against black's king. This move by black is a defensive maneuver to protect the king by activating the bishop to a more central square, aiming to prevent white's pawns from advancing further and potentially creating threats. The promotion of the pawn to a queen is a decisive breakthrough, capitalizing on the exposed black king and lack of defensive pieces to secure a material advantage, and likely win the game. The move 60, kxf8 transitions into a simplified endgame where white's king is activated and his passed pawn on f7 is poised to promote, making it difficult for black to create counterplay. The promotion of the pawn is now inevitable, and the king's centralizing maneuver to support the final push for the queen is a well-executed endgame strategy. White has achieved a decisive material advantage and simplified into a winning endgame, aiming to promote the f-pawn. Black's only hope is to create counterplay with the bishop, though it is unlikely to be sufficient. This endgame is characterized by white's superior king activity, now bringing it to c7 to support the passed pawn and prepare for further advancement. The rook is forced to the corner, preparing to support the pawn advance after black repositions the king to an active square. This move is a crucial step to corner the black king, forcing it into a mating net and consolidating white's advantage. The king's attempt to centralize and support the passed pawn is a sound strategic decision, aiming to activate its latent power and create threats. White captures the pawn on a7, activating the king and preparing to utilize its central presence to support the advanced f-pawn, and potentially win more material or promote. The king advances to a more active central position, aiming to support the passed pawn and potentially participate in the final endgame phase.